everyone. Can you guys hear me? Cool. Okay. My name is Liv. I work at the Berggruen Institute on the Future Humans team. Future Humans is a research initiative that brings together artists, scientists, philosophers, writers to think about the future possibilities of life. So exploring how across disciplines, ideas about life, consciousness, intelligence are being tested, formed, and transformed. We have a bunch of different research projects we do, but the one we'll be discussing here today is called the Future Wunderkammer. We're going to play a short reel for you guys first, and then I'll get back into things.
What will life become? As we humans face increasing uncertainty, we long to reach forward in time, to glimpse beyond our horizon. The Future Wunderkammer is a digital collection of speculative relics, artifacts from near and distant futures that explore humanity's evolving relationship with life, technology, and the cosmos. Imagine digital objects sculpted from singular voices, a device for communicating faster than the speed of light. The essence of who you are, embedded in a vessel that will last 1 billion years. Writing to your future self and receiving a reply. This is just the beginning. The Future Wunderkammer will continue to grow, each new relic a glimpse into possible futures shaped by art, science, and radical imagination. Join us as we explore tomorrow and discover what life will become.
Great. So the Future Wunderkammer project takes its name from the German word Wunderkammer, which literally translates to room of wonder or wonder chamber. It was a word used in 16th century Europe to describe cabinets of curiosities. So rooms that held objects, specimens, new technologies, which were meant to describe or categorize life itself. They were kind of considered a proto-museum of the time, but they often unsettled with their rarities what people thought they knew about the world. What's especially interesting about these collections, though, is that they didn't just reflect knowledge, but rather they produced it. So they shaped how people drew boundaries between the natural and the artificial, between species, and constructed how societies understood the history of life. So our Future Wunderkammer, it takes that idea, but it propels it forward, not only into the contemporary moment, but into the future as well. So the objects in our Wunderkammer are not objects from the past, but rather future relics, as we call them, objects from worlds and realities that have yet to come. These objects, they're not predictions, but they're meant to be tools and conduits for critical thinking, ways of asking what will or what might life become. And that's really the question at the heart of the Future Humans program and the work we do at the Institute. So each relic emerges out of research and practice from different contributors, whether that's neuroscience, astronomy, design, or art. But their final form takes a speculative space. So what you encounter isn't just an artwork or an essay, it's something akin to an object or an interface or a system of interpretation. But the idea is by encountering these objects, I mean, it's an act of play, really. You get to interact with it, and you're being asked to reconsider how you or how we understand life, identity, the self, and the world right now. So today's conversation is really about that process. How does one go from a field like neuroscience or astronomy to something like a divinatory tarot system or a mirror from deep time? What happens in that translation? And how do these speculative objects allow us to think in ways that perhaps other traditional formats might not? So with that, I'm excited to introduce Suparna Choudhury, Richard Hart, and Michael Jones McKean, who each come from very different disciplines, but are all working through this idea of the future relic in really compelling ways. Richard is the graphic designer of our Wunderkammer, both in its digital and print forms, and is the co-founder of Public Official, a creative and design studio based in New York. Suparna is an interdisciplinary researcher and writer positioned between academic and community-based research, as well as experimental arts and healing. She trained in neuroscience, history of philosophy, and creative writing. She is based in Montreal, where she established critical neuroscience at McGill University, a research program which examines the social, cultural, and political context of neuroscience and its implications for society. Most recently, she worked at McGill as a professor teaching in the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry, and is currently co-director of Uncertainty Academy and an affiliate professor at Concordia University. She also is the co-founder of a new program at the Critical Media Lab in Montreal. And her debut novel, Edge Effect, will be released in the spring of 2027 with Invisible Publishing, so keep an eye out for that. And Michael is a sculptor whose work explores the nature of objects in relation to folklore, technology, anthropology, and geography. His work engages in an interest in deep time, timescales and their collapse, in the process decentering anthropocentric registrations of events, distances, and meaning. He has taught at Virginia Commonwealth University in the Sculpture and Extended Media Department since 2006 and is a contributing editor for Art Papers. So thank you guys for being here. Richard, let's start with you. Can you tell everyone here about your work as a designer and your long-standing collaboration with the Future Humans program, and more specifically, of course, the Future Wunderkammer? How does a future relic, in your mind, take shape through your practice with design?
No? Yes? Oh, there we go. Yeah, we were fortunate enough to have an RFP come our way about 3 or 4 years ago from the Future Humans team, which we had never heard of. And it was this amazing sounding project called What Will Life Become? The idea was to create a book and design an event, and it was quite an expansive brief. And we knew that we were kind of pitching for this. But the people at the time, Claire and Emily, that were working on the project were kind of very generous with their time and said, you know, if you have any questions, let us know. And we did. We had questions and kind of challenged some of their thinking. And it became a very instant chemistry that we had. And so we obviously took on that project. At first, it was this book called What Will Life Become?, where a part of the book was these future relics. And there were already some contributors, there were some ideas, and our job was really to just visualize these things, bring them into a space of materiality, although on the printed page, which was a really fun brief. And you know, we got to make this tablet as a space charter, an indigenous space charter, like very imaginative work, which was great. We did that book, and then a few months later, the idea, I'm sure Claire had this for a while, but we were kind of invited to turn this into a digital experience. And that really sort of broadened the canvas, because you know, now these are not pictures of fictitious objects, these are actually something that you can experience in the digital realm. And that was incredibly exciting for a design team like us. So I think it started out with 6, right, Adrian? And some of them we had already kind of thought about, but it becomes this kind of dance. We have Claire, who's the kind of engine behind the whole thing, who has quite strong ideas of how things should be. There's a contributor, an artist, a writer, an academic, and there's us trying to translate what's been, you know, what the conversation has been between the contributor and Claire, the essay that's been written, and turn this into some kind of a digital experience. And that's just become endlessly fascinating and each collaboration is quite different. I think you had some slides we were going to talk about a couple of them, right? Can we? So this is kind of the landing experience on the web page. When we first designed the book, I kind of imagined this typeface made up of these little tiles or sort of pixels. I think there's 12 pixels, and we designed this kind of very simple typeface. And the idea was that, with the question being what will life become, that it's likely to follow a path of evolution and constant change. So the idea was that there would be this typeface that was kind of constantly changing and evolving. And of course that became all the more delightful once we got into the digital realm, and it could actually animate and move and become this kind of fluid, dynamic thing. Can we flip through this to get to the relics? So I'm just going to tell you about a couple that are not Michael and Suparna's, just to kind of give some context. I think the first one that we have is Berggruen Choudhury. She's an artist who collaborates with robots, and it's kind of an example of where the collaborator had a really firm idea of what they wanted to achieve. She basically had created a Gaussian splat model of her studio, which is a 3D model that can kind of be viewed and moved around on the web. And using that and WebGL technology, we kind of created this virtual tour. So you land on her page, you can read the essay on the left-hand side, but her entire studio is the web page. And there's these kind of little green activated areas that if you click into them, you launch separate little pieces of media. So you can look at her library, you can look at her tools. And in this instance, it came together really beautifully, but my involvement was a very light touch. It was simply just taking assets that she had developed and framing them in a way that felt in line with the overall website. The next one I think is Freddy's, right? So a sound artist, and I don't know how Claire comes upon all of her contributors. That's kind of like alchemy. You guys probably know better than me. But this sound artist, Freddie Arswain, I think is his moniker. He had created this sort of soundscape out of found sound. It was conceived, I think, as a musical piece, but it's not entirely musical. It's very experimental. And so we took that and we kind of broke it down into its constituent pieces and basically created a set of instruments. So you can click on each of the images in this. Okay, there we go. Down the bottom, there's this row of images. And these are from a previous job or a previous illustration that we had done for the same project. And if you click on one of those, it will launch one of the instruments in his composition. And the image that we've used for that instrument will respond to the sound itself. So that there's kind of this pulsing that happens using kind of opacity. It gets darker and lighter in response to the sound. I think we're struggling a little bit to get to what I'm talking about, so you'll have to visualize. And then with that piece, it's kind of this building of this world that he's made, and you can deconstruct it, and it becomes completely interactive and something that you're not just consuming, you're actually kind of co-creating. And I think that's what's been really lovely about making these, is that our role is kind of taking an idea that's quite locked in and finding a way to turn that into some kind of an experience. And what's lovely is that it doesn't need to be an illustration of that work. It somehow expands that work. And I think that's what makes the whole project really exciting for us. I think that probably is me giving a decent background, right?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, your design work has been so integral to the project, obviously. And what I love about it in particular is that it really makes a statement of its own. Like, it's so embedded in the conceptual concept, but stands out as its own element. I think maybe we'll. Okay. Suparna, can you talk about your relic, Neurotero, which you've described as a divinatory interface for consciousness, uncertainty, and planetary precarity? How is your background in critical neuroscience embedded in this work?
Yeah, sure. So for background, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, but my work is at the intersection between the neurosciences, the arts, and political movement building. So when I came upon the Future Humans program, there are so few places where academics can experiment with ideas visually, with different modalities of the art. So it's really exciting to be able to think through different media. But I kind of came to Future Humans with an interest in the brain as a cultural organ. So not just an organ that's shaped, empirically speaking, by culture and the way that it acts on the brain, but the way that we have, at least since the mid-20th century, fetishized the brain as a cultural object, the way that we assign meaning and authority and increasingly the truth about how we understand ourselves as human. And I think we give it so much authority, but what's interesting is, as someone who's spent a lot of time in the lab, though it has this epistemic authority and it's got this like whole social life of the brain, we see it in education, in context of mental health, in the law, in everyday vocabularies about how we talk about ourselves as people. In actual fact, neuroscience is riddled with uncertainty and error, and I became really interested in exactly this, in error and what we consider to be noise, and mostly in how the brain is saturated with metaphor, how the brain is a sort of narrative object, a projection site, if you will, onto which we put all our fears and hopes and yearnings about who we want to be or who we want to become. And that's kind of what I've been playing with in this project. I think we're all probably in this room familiar with what brain images typically look like. They've become iconic. But I wanted to do something that was really different from, pixels and colored blobs and clean lines. Normally we think of it as, lines that delineate normality from atypicality, or illness from wellness, or categories of different kinds of people. And I wanted to kind of lean into the narrative power of the brain and think about the Neurotero became an exercise in leaning into narrative and metaphor and being quite playful and in the spirit that you described, a sort of, it's playful, but it's also intellectually or conceptually meant to be subversive, like putting the form of tarot side by side with neuroscience, something that has this designated authority in the way that we think about ourselves, with tarot that's, associated with mysticism and esoterica, and to put both together as two kinds of practices of knowing. I'm interested in how, in conditions of uncertainty, humans seek out certainty. So a lot of this is about that. Where do we look to find truth or guidance? And in many ways, this is about encounters. It's our encounters, whether it's with a soothsayer or a psychiatrist or a therapist or a scientist. It's not so much about finding the truth. It's about the encounter or the relationship between the interpreter and the system, or the interpreter and the person we deem to have authority about who we are. So yeah, it was, I think everybody loves fortune telling and a prophecy here and there to fire up the imagination. But it was beyond play. It was really thinking, what are our human tendencies in moments of social unrest or social uncertainty, or a loss of institutional trust? Where do we look to find that kind of certainty? You can see we've put sort of side by side what we associate, normally with images of neuroscience, and we were leaning in completely the opposite direction. I don't know, should I describe how the project actually works? So there's an essay online, but it's not a scholarly essay like most of the others. It's much more like sort of fictional. I'll read you how it begins. It's sort of like the aim is the essay sets the scene, and it gives you this kind of futuristic landscape, and then you do the exercise. So it starts, you, the querent, sit before the reader at a table draped with a cloth of rich jewel tones. The room is dimly lit, save for a smooth orb in the left-hand corner, which emits a warm cadmium glow. Your predicament is shared. The neuromancer leads a conversation that digs deeper into details, characters, affects, atmospheres, and a scan of the nervous system follows. The metal crown hovers above your head and drops a cloak of light beams straight down to your toes, forming streams of amber that fall like insistent evening rain. A faint, sporadic knocking turns into a thudding kick drum, pleasantly hypnotic until it quietens again when your protons tilt back to their resting positions. The thin silence is broken by a rush of your speech, internal and uttered. In these moments, you feel the weight of uncertainty bear down on you. You're suddenly hypervigilant, a white-tailed deer at dusk. Questions clutter the air between you. Will your lover remain true, kind at least? Will you find the courage to leave your stultifying job? Will your child ever be able to see a Bengal tiger? Will democracy survive? Will the magnolia tree? Your gaze is searching, your palms a little sticky as you try to bend your mind's eye over the present, hopeful for a glimpse of the future silhouette, a taste of its outline. And then, with AI, you put in your question, your predicament about anything, and we had 6 zeitgeist cards, like, archetypes of the brain from contemporary and computational neuroscience. And it presents you with a card randomly, and then offers you a sort of prescription or a response to your quandary in the language of that particular card. So there's the empathic brain, the uncertain brain, there's one about memory. They're all behind. And that's it. And I can talk later perhaps about the process with Richard, which was so much fun and so seamless, as we've spoken about. But I think that gives you a sort of fair intro to the project.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really beautiful paradox of inhabiting uncertainty through something that's traditionally considered to be certain. Michael, I think your relic does similar conceptual work, but at a cosmic scale. So if you could take us through your project, The Last Mirror.
Sure. So I'm an artist, but more specifically, I think of myself as a sculptor. So what's a sculptor? As somebody that perhaps thinks about objects and their meaning in a very particular way. I think, just for context, I think, we're at this book fair, and it's interesting to imagine, in many ways, how objects act as a kind of an in-between, a kind of a medium that really allows us to even be together. If you think of all of the kinds of interactions that we have, usually there's some kind of object that acts as a medium between that interaction. So I think it's this idea of the future Wunderkammer, this idea of like a relic that gets cast into the future, for me is something that as a sculptor I'm already thinking about all the time. So the object that is part of this project is actually lives inside of a much larger project that I've been working on for about 9 years now called 12 Earths, which we could talk about it for a while, but in a nutshell, it's a planetary sculpture that the form is a circumference ring that wraps around the planet that connects 12 locations. At each one of those locations, there's something, of course. And at one of them, there's an observatory. And so if you can, in your mind's eye, if you could imagine going to Chile, climbing somehow the Andes, the foothills of the Andes and the Atacama Desert, you would, against all odds, you would find an observatory there. And this is a generational object, really, like a really special kind of object that humans have been working on for the last 30 years. It's in an incredibly remote part of the world, and it creates a kind of mythology, even knowing that it's how difficult it is to reach and the ceremonies that are required to actually even get there. So through this project, I became the artist in residence of the observatory, which is a kind of unbelievable thing that I still pinch myself about. And so I've been going there for years, getting closer to the astronomers that are there, but also like trying to get closer and closer to the object. The spiritual core of the object is this mirror. So the mirror, this is actually a good sized room. The mirror would just touch probably end to end at each part here. So it's an incredibly large object. The mirror acts as a kind of super erotic object in a way. And one, it's because of its perfection, it's enchanted. It lives on the edge of what humans are capable of. So it's a kind of culturally, you could think of it as a kind of apex object. Like it encodes so much of what humans collectively have figured out about the material world. So this goes back to probably the humans finding flint and learning how to nap it to create a sharp edge. This is, it goes to the Venetians, sort of like being a hub and learning all the alchemic ways in which glass could form. So the object is this big, but it's 55,000 pounds of glass. So it's glass, so it's an inert object. So it doesn't age. It doesn't degrade. It doesn't kind of decompose in the same way that most of the objects do around us. So it's already a kind of an incredible archival kind of object. So there is this question about, what it can tell us of ourselves. And these kinds of objects in which like thousands and thousands of people that are living amongst us right now essentially hold hands with millions of people spread through time, they manage to tell us a lot, and they manage to encode quite a bit about what we can achieve technically. But also there's a spiritual dimension, I think, to the work that has been interesting to me. But you could imagine it at a different scale, like also maybe archaeologically, finding like a pottery shard or something like that. So something that we can understand at the scale of our bodies and our life. So you find a pottery shard, and pretty quickly there's a kind of forensics that emerges with that object, where if you gave it to someone that had a certain skill set, they could tell you that something very specific about that culture, about how advanced they were in terms of their trade routes, how advanced they were in terms of their science, how advanced they were in terms of the ways in which that they understood transformation of chemicals on a molecular level. So something as tiny as a pottery shard relays all of these kinds of secret dimensions about what humans were able to do at a certain moment. So I've been thinking of this mirror as a kind of surrogate in a way, as a way to help us understand a certain set of ideas that we've come to possess. There's also a set of questions that for me, like when I think of this idea of the future relic, like how far are we thinking? And so are we thinking 100 years? Are we thinking 1,000 years? For an object like this that lives on top of a mountain, that's extremely hard to get to, that's made out of material that won't ever degrade. It's an exercise in actually the limitations of our own ability to think. Like how, is it 50,000 years? Is it 100,000 years? Is it 1,000,000 years? Like these are all distances and temporalities that open up when you're dealing with an object like this. So it also creates a set of questions around kind of a productive misunderstanding, a kind of object that becomes an unreliable narrator of its own story at that distance. And that to me, I think is something that's very fun to think about, like an object that if we discovered it, we would know less about its intention, but we would see a kind of perfection in its surface and an intention of human endeavor that we would project into. And that's really the kind of the other side of this object specifically is the idea of the mirror. The mirror as a kind of surface that allows us to both collect, in this case, like the erotics is contact. Like it's literally making contact with primordial light photons. Like its sole job is to make contact. But it's also an object that we project into. So that is, there's lots more to talk about, but those are some riffs, and I'm happy to find some connections between it all.
Thank you. Yeah. Before we move into more of a dialogue, maybe Richard, you can speak to the design of the relic. It's not live on the website yet. It's still a work in progress. This is a still, and then Adrian, if you go to the next. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And I think this is where it becomes quite clear that each of these collaborations with one of the contributors is an entirely different experience. If you see Michael's work and understand where he comes from, I would have suspected he would be incredibly prescriptive, maybe even neurotic, but not at all. And so we had several calls and tried to figure out a way that we can communicate this deep time. And the idea that kind of emerged was a looping piece of film where you start at the furthest reaches of the solar system, you move at incredible speed towards the Earth. You're always slowing down. It's a clean deceleration. By the time you reach the Earth's atmosphere, you're actually going really slowly. And by the time you're close to the surface of the Earth, you're going, centimeters or millimeters a year. And you actually see the observatory itself break down, and the mirror is revealed, something that happens over hundreds of years, if not 100 years. And then you find yourself back in the mirror, and it takes you back to the beginning of the loop. And that was it was kind of a very simple idea that I think we kind of arrived at together, right? Yeah. And then we work with developers, and we work with a budget, which is not a DreamWorks budget, so there are a lot of constraints. But essentially, once this goes live in probably the next week or so, it will be a scrollable experience where you can kind of go as slowly or as fast as you like, and you get to kind of travel this journey towards the mirror and into the mirror and through the mirror and back to the beginning of the journey. And I think we like the way that said something about time, and I'll let you riff on that if you want to.
Yeah, no, and I think also, maybe it's clear, but it's a scrollable experience. So the speed that you're seeing here is actually controlled. It's much slower. So, yeah.
Or faster, depending
Or
how you
faster,
scroll.
yeah, maybe you want to go really fast, actually.
Yeah.
Probably attention spans.
Maybe.
Great, yeah. So I love the role that divination plays across both relics. So maybe you guys could speak to that more. I mean, there's such a rich history of esoteric and mystical and religious impulses that have permeated and sometimes been crucial to the development of technologies, often like communication technologies. I think this was genealogy first written by Eric Davis in the 90s. So neurotarot treats the brain as oracle, as prophetic, often erroneous, but embracing that error. And then the mirror operates within, like you said, a long lineage of mirrors as oracular surfaces. There's the obsidian mirror, so the first black mirror that was used in Mesoamerican spiritual rituals, and was considered by priests and shamans to be a conduit to communicating with deities. So what does it, I guess in both of your relics, what does it mean to use a tool of divination, a tarot deck or a mirror, to ask questions that science usually lays claim to?
Okay, now? Yeah. I think across history, we've looked to so many sites, to so many spaces for oracles. Again, I want to situate the Neurotarot project in the context or the question of uncertainty. And what do we do in conditions of uncertainty? Well, we've looked to the formations of stars, to entrails, to the way that things are inscribed in the body, and now to the location or the activity of networks inside the skull, in the brain. And I find I'm interested in how right now, these networks in the brain, they sort of glow in brain scans with apparent certainty, but the whole idea of putting it in the form of tarot was to kind of pull out the idea that there's a deeply interpretive act in doing neuroscience. Obviously, tarot is an interpretive exercise. It's just that one of these activities acknowledges its own interpretive aspect. Neuroscience tends to obscure the role of the interpreter, and that's what I was really trying to pull out. What else would I say? I'm interested in general, and I think Neurotarot is trying to get at the question of how, when we don't know, the site of authority tends to migrate to opaque places, the black box of the brain or an algorithm. But in fact, knowledge or interpretation isn't being sort of eliminated, even though neuroscience would purport to say that it is. It's just being redistributed in the form of data, in the form of visual imagery. So that was really the idea for me of putting something that's so far removed from being thought of as divination in the form of divination. And the visual work, the visual language of these cards is doing a lot of the epistemic work. Instead of clean lines and pixelated visuals, it was a mashup of like Hindu iconography and all sorts of non-Western cosmologies, bringing spirituality and ritual into the foreground rather than those, the things that we try and take out of the space of science. So yeah, there was a lot of play in doing that. And between us, what we were doing is kind of trying to translate those concepts, what's going on in the idea, can we reinterpret the plastic brain, which we normally see as clumps of synapses that change in their formation over time? what does plasticity, it's taken up in our everyday language, in pop science, in psychiatry, in so many different ways. Through the lens of mysticism, what could it look like? But to have the same language in text as neuroscience, but just a completely different aesthetic. I'll pass it over.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, it made me think of a couple of things. And I mean, you know, one, you would know way better than me, but like thinking of the brain as a kind of predictive software in a way, the way that it seeks pattern as a way to try to unfurl what might occur. And the point of contact that I was thinking of just historically with this observatory, there's a really very famous story about Galileo sharing his first telescope with one of the mayor of a small village where he had been working, and they went out and they looked across the sea with the telescope, and they could see small ships coming into port. And immediately, it wasn't a kind of scientific explosion at first. It was a kind of predictive object that allowed people to wage war in a more in a way where you could see your enemy coming 2 hours before they could see you. So, like thinking of this as a model, but more like the mystical aspect of it. It reminds me of being on when I was on the summit last of Cerro Pachon, where the mirror is. There's a phenomena that occurs almost with everyone that happens when you get near the mirror, and it's so much so that they when you go to see it, usually you have to be roped in. And what happens is that people see the mirror, and it's an experience that you really can't ever prepare for. Like, there's no other analog to it. You fall in. Your body just leans into it, and there's actually all these occurrences of people kind of like ruining mirrors, like falling into these mirrors and scraping them up, and they have to repolish them and stuff. But it's like, we don't really know why. I mean, we kind of know why, but there's something kind of mystical about this object that doesn't make sense so much, and it's sort of, we're magnetized to it. Quite literally, we fall into it. So it's a bit of an adjacent way of answering, I think, this question about divination, but this idea of objects that exude a kind of mysticism in real time when we're around them, a kind of magnetism and a kind of pull.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to leave a little bit of time for a Q&A from the audience at the end, but before we do that, I have one last question I'd love each of you to speak to, you too, Richard, in terms of design, which is just how can these relics as speculative objects or speculative artifacts that look back at us from the possible future, what do they teach us about our present moment, about the now?
Richard, you haven't spoken for a while.
I'll let one of you guys go first. You guys are the brains.
Do you have an answer ready at hand? I could. Thank you.
Okay. So if in the fictional future someone were to find these Nero tarot cards, I think they would capture attention in human tendencies towards the unknown. So at the very moment that we're confronted with so much social, political, ecological uncertainty and precarity, we tend to seek more and more certainty, more and more knowns. And to me, this is like a little indicator as to what are the conditions of truth that we set? Where do we look for certainty? I don't think this relic resolves that, but it just shows us how we sort of sit inside moments of uncertainty and how we try and metabolize uncertainty, which is usually, grossly uncomfortable for us. I think that we would look back at this moment, and these cards would show that it's an age of externalizing a lot of human judgment and human thought to machines, to data, to things that feel separate from being human, while we're simultaneously obsessing over our own human interiority. So I think there's an interesting tension in that. And then I've been thinking, wouldn't it have been great if we were mining the actual questions that users were putting into the system and the responses that the AI was giving? Because it would be a great indicator of what our collective hopes and anxieties are. And like, can we do that? Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about, there's a way. Well, in thinking of it, how an object encodes things, there's lots of ways that we, I think, on a scientific level, an object like this relays important data. But more than that, it's an optimistic object. If you think of the aggregate human touches that have accumulated in an object this sophisticated, it's like billions of touches, and it's a kind of collective touch of thousands and thousands of people over years and years. And so, perhaps that's like the reason that people fall into them. It's like you can't understand them. So there's maybe 10 of these on the planet, and they all hold this kind of optimism about what humans can do when we can collaborate with each other, when we can communicate across languages, when we summon some kind of collective energy and commitment to work on something for not just a week or a year, but decades. So in a really analog way, an object like that holds that kind of care and optimism that I think can be translated through time.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we have a few minutes if any of you want to ask some questions.
Thanks for mentioning that. I mean, yeah, it's kind of, said the way I said, it's a little bit of a non sequitur, but yeah, it seems like all objects are desiring a kind of contact. Like all objects are trying to transform. So it's like we want to come into contact with others, and in their embrace, that's where the erotics emerges. We transform, and so like thinking of this jewel-like object, that exists on top of a mountain, that's honed to a kind of calibration that's at the molecular level, like of perfection. And thinking of that object's sole function is to commune with primordial photons. Like, to me, that just feels like so sexy and erotic. Like, I just love thinking about this thing using those terms. But more generally, I think there's probably a theory of eroticism that we could that we could overlay on almost all kinds of objects and the way that they're wishing to transform with each other. Say more. What do you say more? Mm. Well, you know, we get bored really easily, right? Yeah. So we want it all. So we want to be enchanted, and we want to fall in love, and we want it all. So yeah, maybe that's great.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for today, but thank you all so much, and thank you guys for coming. Come visit us at booth E16. We have a 3-part series on the Future of Wunderkammer project, and then you can also explore the relics, all the beautiful images you just saw up here, online at the link over there in the corner. Yeah, thanks.